समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है, अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या समझ में नहीं आया?
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
In Pakistan, they are once again brutalizing, obliterating, or simply rewriting their constitution. In the process, Asim Munir has become Field Marshal for life. He was Field Marshal, now he's Field Marshal for life. Not honorary, full-time Field Marshal for life. And not just the Chief of the Army, but also Chief of the Air Force and the Navy as well. He's also gifted himself lifelong immunity from any charges or prosecution. At the same time, under the new order brought in by the 27th Amendment to Pakistan's already mutilated constitution, and this amendment has just been rammed through Pakistani National Assembly and Senate, the Supreme Court has been eviscerated. High courts emasculated and the judiciary made subordinate to the executive, which in turn is hopelessly subservient to the army. And as I told you earlier, the Air Force and the Navy have become subordinated to the army as well. Now, what is it that the Pakistanis are saying in this? Some sensible Pakistanis, well-known Pakistanis names are complaining about this and saying and calling it out for what it is, a complete destruction of the constitutional order or whatever survived of it after so many years of post-Nawaz Sharif depredations by the army. Nawaz Sharif was removed while he had a fairly strong majority and power. He was removed. Since then, the army has been playing with the constitution. Even by those standards, what has happened right now is drastic, it's radical, and it basically not only finishes Pakistan's constitution, but also makes Asim Munir like the permanent ruler, like the monarch of Pakistan with no successor. So what is it that sensible Pakistanis are calling it? So two of Pakistan's most eminent journalists, editors, Zahid Hussain, who's been an old friend of mine. He's written for us when I used to work at India Today, then at the Indian Express, at the Print also early on. He's one of the finest voices, author of many books on Pakistan, and also Maliha Lodhi. Maliha Lodhi, former editor in Pakistan, then a former diplomat. She was Pakistan's ambassador to the UN as well. Also an old fellow traveler. In fact, in 1988, when Zia was killed, assassinated or not, I don't know, but Zia died in that C-130 crash. I wrote my cover story for India Today from Islamabad, from Maliha Lodhi's office in the newspaper, The Muslim. Each has written a column in Dawn. I will just give you the headlines of these columns. Zahid's column is headlined, Killing the Constitution. See it on your screens. I will share a link with you. And Maliha Lodhi's column is headlined, Slide into Authoritarianism. Both absolutely accurately state what has happened. What does all this mean? How we got to this stage? I will explain to you as we go along, so do stay with me. To understand, however, the dramatic turn now, we need to appreciate how we got here. Constitutions in Pakistan have had about as much longevity as its prime ministers, or we can say both have had about equal half-life, flickering, fading, disappearing. Sometimes physically so as well. Starting with the first Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan, assassinated in 1951. You remember the famous Nehru-Liaquat Pact? That Nehru-Liaquat Pact became just a piece of paper because soon after Liaquat Ali Khan was assassinated. The fact is Pakistan has had many constitutions, but they got their first only in 1956. That is almost 10 years after its birth in 1947. It barely survived 2 years, right? It took them almost 10 years to get that constitution. It barely survived 2 years because you can see that probably Pakistani nationalism, the way it was not defined in such a way, Pakistani nationalism, that it was destined to be a constitutional state, or at least the challenges of creating a constitutional state out of it were very, very, very formidable. As I told you, it took almost 10 years, 4 governors general, 4 prime ministers, 1 president, the last governor general, 4th governor general also became president, and 2 constituent assemblies to get themselves the first constitution in 1956. And now also an incidental fact, which is also quite interesting, that the first amendment to Pakistan's 1973 constitution came along with the constitution, because that amendment described the territories of Pakistan, leaving out what used to be East Pakistan, because Pakistan had already recognized Bangladesh. And the second amendment is what defined Pakistan's politics, and Pakistan's politics, religion, conflict, as well as relationship since then. The second amendment defined who's a Muslim, because if it's an Islamic republic, who's a Muslim? And that amendment then laid out, for example, that an Ahmadi cannot be described as a Muslim in Pakistan. An Ahmadi is an apostate. India brought in its own constitution in 1950. The fourth and the last Governor General, Iskandar Mirza, who, by the way, also became the first president, simply transitioning from one role to the other, if briefly. In the subcontinent's messy, multi-layered history, he would also be remembered as the great-grandson of Mir Jafar. Remember Mir Jafar? Yes, of the Battle of Plassey infamy. The constitution, which was abrogated in 1958 when martial law was imposed by Iskandar Mirza. So the first martial law was imposed by a civilian president. Martial law was imposed by Iskandar Mirza. Now, once you impose martial law, you need a general to administer it. He brought in General Ayub Khan to administer his martial law, Iskandar Mirza's martial law. In the course of time, or in the course of very short time, the general had his president fired and became a dictator, as the chief martial law administrator should be, right? Why should a chief martial law administrator report to anybody, president or whatever? In the course of a very short time, he also promoted himself to field marshal, because he said, I have so much to do, I need an army chief, so I appointed an army chief, but then the army chief had to report to somebody up the order within the army, up the uniformed order. So he made himself field marshal much before, decades before Idi Amin made himself field marshal. Ayub Khan had already created a precedent. Of course, he abrogated his country's first constitution, because if the constitution was there, then all this tamasha that he had created would not survive. That constitution, therefore, lived 2 years. Asim Munir, therefore, is the second field marshal in Pakistan's history. He might have had one regret, however, that his power over the government is de facto, not de jure. That he has now fixed by mutilating his republic's constitution. Ayub brought in the second constitution in 1962. So already in quick order, 10 years for the first constitution, in 2 years that constitution goes. 4 years later, yet another constitution is brought in with no resemblance to the first 1956 constitution, which Ayub brought in 1962. This brought in a curiosity, a global curiosity, that he described as guided democracy, right? You know who the guide is. Friend, philosopher, guide, master, commander, you know who that was. So he brought in guided democracy with his 1962 constitution and abolished the prime ministership. In fact, the prime minister then survived just a few days. He abolished the prime ministership. Then in 1969, 7 years after that so-called constitution was brought in, public anger grew as the reality of the failed 1965 war with India became apparent and the economy declined. 1969, Ayub Khan scooted, right? He escaped from power because he was forced to give up power. His 1962 constitution went to the trash can with him. Yahya Khan came in, General Yahya Khan, only general, not field marshal. Yahya Khan came in as the new dictator with his new martial law. Why would he need a constitution? We know how he went out in defeat and disgrace in December 1971. In 1973, Bhutto succeeded him, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, he succeeded him. In 1973, Bhutto brought in a constitution. It was a fairly proper constitution of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. that constitution in a way still endures, except that every few years a new power rises in Pakistan to alter it to suit its own needs or his own needs. Almost always, in fact, always a military power that brutalizes that constitution and damages it to such an extent that it becomes unrecognizable. So, what is it that's happened right now? 27th Amendment of Pakistani Constitution of 1973 has been steamrolled through Parliament and Senate. It requires 2/3 majority. In the Senate, there was a problem, so some defections were organized. No problem, it was done. But you know what? This is a country that's owned by the army in any case, so who needs to count? Because while there is supposedly an elected government, it's hardly an elected government. It's an appointed government, such as it is. And it cannot say anything to the army. Field Marshal Asim Munir has now become as powerful as Musharraf might have been as dictator, maybe even more. Because, all said and done, Musharraf was a Muhajir. He was an Urdu-speaking Muhajir. This one is very Punjabi. And he's also Hafiz Quran. Musharraf had dogs. Musharraf drank some whiskey. Musharraf was not really an Islamist army chief and dictator. This one is. Further, learning from the fate of Musharraf, who faced trial and conviction for treason after losing power, Munir is giving himself an insurance. Insurance like this does not always work, we know, as black swan events can come in anybody's life, including a field marshal's. In fact, I would say, especially in a dictator's life, dictators' lives are ultimately cut short, or dictators find their match in their own black swan events. Nevertheless, there is no harm taking an insurance, which Munir has done. So see what Munir is doing. In summary, what does this 27th Amendment do? First of all, it formally makes the army, not the armed forces, the army the preeminent power in Pakistan. How does it work? I am explaining to you. First of all, it says that the army chief now will automatically have a second title of Chief of Defence Forces. So, Army Chief, Chief of Army Staff and Chief of Defence Forces, the same man. Which means the army also becomes the boss of Air Force and the Navy. So, the Air Force and the Navy become subservient to the army. Permanently and constitutionally. This is not an administrative arrangement. I do not believe that any major country, that too a nuclear weapon country with such large armed forces, has this clarity. Or if you so wish, you can call it this clutter, depending on how you see it. We will see how it works out. But now with this amendment, the army chief by constitution will be Chief of Defence Forces. So the Chief of Army Staff come Chief of Defence Forces doesn't always have to be Field Marshal. However, once somebody becomes Field Marshal, as Asim Munir has done, he will be Field Marshal for life. For life, which means that a Field Marshal now will have his rank, his pay and allowances, his privilege and uniform for life. So can you imagine Asim Munir living on till 110? Notionally, but still walking around, strutting about in his uniform with all that tamjam and paraphernalia. Besides the fact that once appointed a Field Marshal will always be a Field Marshal, serving Field Marshal at whatever age, even more importantly, the Field Marshal now will have the same protections, the same constitutional protection from either prosecution on any charges, etc., as the President of Pakistan does. That is under Article 248 of Pakistani Constitution, whereby now a chief who becomes a Field Marshal cannot be prosecuted for anything he might have done wrong, anything. This is the caution after Musharraf's fate. In America, you find outgoing presidents give pardons to people who they think might be targeted by the newcomer or who were their loyalists or family members, as Biden did. Or in case of Trump, he can also give preemptive pardons. But he can also spread them around. Trump can spread them around. But can he give somebody immunity for life? Can he give himself immunity for life? Not just for actions he might have undertaken as president in office, but also in his personal life? No. But that's been done in Pakistan now for the Field Marshal. It's a bit more fun, in fact, in Pakistan now. The constitutional immunity for the president ends once the incumbent goes out of office. The same protection under Article 248 applies mutatis mutandis. That is what That is what the amendment says, mutatis mutandis, to the Field Marshal, as the 27th Amendment says. How come he gets immunity for life then? Because the president goes away, the immunity belongs to the office, not to the individual. How come it belongs to Asim Munir for life? Because remember, the same amendment says that the Field Marshal serves for life, right? So Field Marshal has the immunity, and because Field Marshal serves for life, it becomes lifelong immunity. Such things might have happened under some storied African dictators like, say, Idi Amin, but never in a country as large and significant as Pakistan, that too one that claims to be a constitutional republic. The 27th Amendment specifically rewrites Article 243 of Pakistani Constitution, which defines the relations between the civilian authority and the armed forces in terms of who controls whom and how. This has been gutted. Article 243 has now been gutted. This army chief will now be the commander of all forces. That means Navy and Air Force as well. Then with this, the office of the Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee will now be abolished. This office, incidentally, came up as a consequence of the 1971 defeat of the Pakistani Armed Forces. After that, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto set up a commission under a Supreme Court judge. It was called the Justice Hamudur Rahman Commission, which gave many recommendations, but one of these was that there should be a mechanism whereby the three forces can work closer together, or what is usually called jointmanship in the armed forces. Because there were many stories about 1971 war when one did not know what the other was doing between the Pakistani Army, Navy, Air Force, because after defeat there will be recriminations. For example, when the Indian Navy and the Indian Air Force were both raining hell over Karachi, and continuously for more than a couple of days, completely unquestioned, unchallenged by the Pakistani Air Force, there was a story of Pakistani Navy chief calling his PAF counterpart to ask, what the hell is happening? You are not here. I am in trouble. The story may be apocryphal or may have been spiced up. It is possible. But it also goes that the PAF chief told his naval counterpart something like, calm down, old boy, this is war. Such things happen. Nevertheless, Justice Hamudur Rahman Commission's recommendation was that there should be a Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee. This was to have a chairman, a 4-star, a chairman who would come from any of the three forces by a rotation, as indeed has been the tradition in India. They take turns, Army, Navy and Air Force. In Pakistan, it did not quite work out that way, as 15 of the 18 chairmen so far have been army generals, 2 navy admirals and 1 air marshal sneaked in at some points, but that is only 3 out of 18. These chairmen, JCSC, from the army include General Sahir Shamshad Mirza, whose speech we had quoted from just the other day in Cut the Clutter. I will share a link with you. You can check it out again. He is the one who said, in India, the problem is that politics has become militarized and military has become politicized, etc. And also said that India has conventional superiority, which makes Pakistan's nuclear weapons that much more important. How he describes changes in his own country now, we shall see. That was a very provocative statement from him. He finishes his term on November 27th. That is the day on which this 27th Amendment dissolves the office of the Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee. That's over now. The institution is over. That office is history. That institution is not needed because everything is now sitting under the Chief of Army Staff, who's also the Chief of Defence Forces. That one man takes care of jointmanship, I suppose. If I'm the only one in charge, then I'm the joint man. A cabinet meeting was held on 7th of November. On 7th of November, when Shehbaz Sharif, the Prime Minister, and also Asim Munir were in Baku for Azerbaijan's celebration of what they call as the National Victory Day, that is victory in the war with Armenia. Sharif is more material here than Munir because it is his cabinet. He's the Prime Minister. He was in Baku and he presided over the cabinet meeting from Baku by video conferencing, and he approved this epochal amendment on video conferencing. this is a little bit like that cartoon by Abu Abraham during the emergency when President Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad was signing ordinances all the time, and Fakhruddin Saab lying in the bathtub after signing one ordinance hands it over to his orderly and says, "Listen, if there are more ordinances, can they wait until I finish my bath?" So it's a bit like that. You preside over your own cabinet meeting through video conferencing to bring in an amendment that destroys your own power completely. You know what? This reminds me of a 1952 song. There was a 1952 film called On. And that had a song which is still hummed by a lot of people across generations. Dil mein chupa ke pyar ka tufan le chale, hum aaj apni maut ka saman le chale. So right, this may not be any storm or tempest of love in the heart of Shahbaz Sharif and his cabinet, but basically they were presenting and certifying and rubber stamping the agenda of their own destruction. To that extent, the second line, "Hum aaj apni maut ka saman le chale," fully applies to this. This amendment was immediately moved to both the houses, and it went through the two houses like a hot knife goes through butter. You might ask with good reason, why such crashing hurry for Sharif to hold his cabinet meeting on video conferencing? Couldn't he have done so when he returned in a couple of days back to Islamabad? It is Munir who was rushed, as I understand. His 3-year term ends this November. While with the 26th Amendment carried out in September 2024, the chief's tenure had been made 5 years, but you know what? These things do not apply retrospectively. So he was appointed for 3 years. He would have needed a 2-year extension now by the president. Munir didn't want that. He also didn't want the extension because that would have also made his tenure finite. He doesn't want his tenure to look finite. He wants to end all argument, all tension, speculation, intrigue, and rona dhona over his position by cementing it for life. You can laugh if you so wish, but in fairness, we must mention that the amendment also says that if somebody is given the rank of Marshal of the Air Force or Admiral of the Fleet, the 5-star equivalents in the other two forces, Air Force and the Navy, they will also have the same privileges. And why this lifelong service and privileges? Because the constitutional amendment says these will be national heroes. Show me another republic with a constitution which also defines living human beings as national heroes and their privileges, the rank, pay, pomp, and show for the rest of their lives, and also immunity from any charges for entire lifetimes. Now, what will they do if they retire? When they retire, if they retire, say in the course of time, a new field marshal or at least a new chief comes in, because after all, somebody can't be chief forever. You can't be 90, 95 years old and still be the chief of army staff. Somebody else will become the chief of army staff who will also be the chief of defense forces. What will these field marshals do now? Or what will this field marshal do now? The experience of Pakistan has been that whenever the chief becomes the president or takes political power, the ambition of the next in line does not get extinguished. They start pushing upwards. General Mirza Aslam Beg troubled Ziaul Haq, and Musharraf similarly hassles with Ashraf Parvez Kayani. This amendment doesn't stop here. This also establishes a national strategic command that will control all the nuclear weapons of Pakistan. Obviously, this national strategic command will need a commander. That commander will also be chosen, obviously, by the army chief and commander of defense forces, although supposedly in consultation with the prime minister. For clarity, commander of strategic forces, national strategic command, will also come only from the army, exclusively from the army, and can never be from the Navy and the Air Force. There isn't full clarity yet, but it seems that the current Nuclear Command Authority, which also has strong civilian representation, will now be abolished. This means the Pakistani army will now have total and final control of its nuclear assets, and Pakistani army is not known particularly for its intellect. The Prime Minister and Cabinet are reduced to court jesters. I told you earlier that this amendment does two major things One, it changes civil-military relations in Pakistan completely, and second, it eviscerates Pakistan's judiciary and also the civilian government's power. Now, that is something that we'll talk about in the next episode of Cut the Clutter. It's right now I'm focusing on the changes with the military and the civil defense relationship, the rise of the establishment of the field marshal, immunized for life, the army chief becoming the chief of navy and the air force, and the army also taking full control of the nuclear weapons, because all of this is more material for us in India. For people of Pakistan, maybe these don't matter so much because they are used to their army having so much power. For them, the more material changes might be what's happened to their judiciary and how radically their executive judiciary relations have been altered. Those we will talk about in the next episode of Cut the Clutter.